Hello, everyone, and thanks for viewing this presentation on my term paper for our class on Hegel and the phenomenology of spirit. Today, I want to explore a comparison between Hegel's account of desire in the phenomenology of spirit and early Buddhist teachings on craving in the Four Noble Truths. At first, these might seem like very different traditions. Hegel is writing in the context of German idealism and is concerned with the development of consciousness, while Buddhism is concerned with suffering, liberation, and the path out of samsara. Even so, both traditions take desire seriously as a central feature of human life, and both see ordinary desire as unstable in a deep and reoccurring way. My paper argues that this shared attention to desire opens up a productive comparison. In both Hegel and early Buddhism, desire does not simply aim at an object and then come to rest when that object is attained. Instead, desire reveals a more basic dissatisfaction built into the ordinary standpoint of the self. Satisfaction repeatedly collapses back into lack, and the self discovers that what it did not finally secure in the fulfillment that it expected. So the key point, however, is that the two traditions respond to this instability very differently. Early Buddhism treats craving as the cause of suffering and therefore something to be relinquished. Hegel, by contrast, treats dissatisfaction as the very force that pushes consciousness forward into richer and more mediated forms of life. So the comparison is not meant to collapse Hegel into Buddhism or vice versa, but to clarify how both diagnose desire and how differently they imagine moving beyond its failure. The central thesis of this paper is that Hegel and early Buddhism converge in their diagnosis of desire, but diverge sharply in their understanding of its resolution. Both traditions show that desire is structurally unstable. It does not end itself, and it does not finally settle the self into a state of completion. Instead, desire tends to reproduce dissatisfaction, and that repeated dissatisfaction reveals something important about the self's ordinary way of relating to the world. In Hegel, this instability becomes philosophically productive. The failure of desire is not just a problem, it's the engine of development. Consciousness learns through disappointment, and what it first takes to be certain breaks down, and that breakdown forces it into a richer standpoint. Hegel's phenomenology therefore treats desire, conflict, and dissatisfaction as moments in the education of consciousness and not merely as pathologies to be removed. Early Buddhism interprets the same instability differently. In the Four Noble Truths, suffering or unsatisfactoriness is tied to craving, and the task is not to preserve that movement as development, but to bring craving to an end. This distinction I want to emphasize then is between the two different orientations. Hegelian reconciliation, wherein desire is transformed and mediated within spirit, and Buddhist cessation, where craving is relinquished as part of liberation. That contrast gives the whole paper its organizing structure. Before getting into the main comparison, I need to clarify on the method. Hegel and early Buddhism are not simply offering two versions of the same theory. Hegel's phenomenology of spirit presents a developmental account in which consciousness moves through a series of shapes or standpoints. Accordingly to Stephen Holgate's immanent reading, Hegel does not impose an external system on these stages. Instead, each standpoint reveals its own limits from within, and natural consciousness educates itself by encountering its own contradictions. Early Buddhist teaching has a different aim and structure. The Four Noble Truths are not primarily a phenomenology of consciousness as in Hegel's sense. They are a storyological framework where ordinary life is marked by dukkha, and that is suffering, and that has its origins in craving, and the end of the craving is possible, and that there is a path to lead towards that ending. And the truths are meant to guide, practice, and transform, and not merely to describe the stages of consciousness conceptually. That difference matters a lot because I don't want to overstate the comparison. I'm not claiming that Hegel is really presenting the Four Noble Truths in this disguised philosophical form, nor that Buddhism is simply another dialectical system. My claim is narrower, and I think that makes it much more defensible, where ultimately the specific movements in Hegel's phenomenology reveal a structural logic of dissatisfaction that can be fruitfully read alongside Buddhist analysis of craving and suffering. The comparison is therefore analogical and structural, but not a claim of similar identity. This also helps to frame what the paper focuses on. Rather than comparing entire worldviews in the abstract, I focus on three particular Hegelian movements of self-consciousness as desire, the unhappy consciousness, and the law of the heart. These moments trace a pattern of increasingly mediated and reflected dissatisfaction, and I read that pattern into relation to the Buddhist sequence of suffering, craving, cessation, and the path to liberation. So the first major Hegelian movement in this paper is the claim that self-consciousness is desire. This is one of the most striking moves in the phenomenology. Hegel does not begin self-consciousness as a transparent inward awareness of the self, but instead self-consciousness is immediately restless and outward moving. It tries to secure its own certainty by negating what stands over and against it. In that sense, desire is not an accidental feature or self-consciousness. It belongs to its very structure. And what this means is that the self tries to prove itself by overcoming or consuming the object. It does not merely contemplate with what is other than itself. It tries to cancel that otherness in order to experience itself as independent. But this strategy immediately runs into a problem. Once the object is overcome, the satisfaction attached to it disappears as well, and the self has destroyed the very thing through which satisfaction was supposed to occur, and so desire reappears, and the result is a cycle rather than any kind of resolution. This is a crucial point for comparison with Buddhism. Hegel is showing that ordinary desire is inherently unstable. It promises satisfaction, but its fulfillment undermines itself. The self discovers that what it wants cannot be secured by immediate negation or possession. In Hegel's hands, this failure becomes philosophically important because it pushes consciousness beyond its first naive understanding of what fulfillment would be. We can also see here why dissatisfaction is so central to the larger movement of the phenomenology. Hegel is not simply saying that people happen to want too much. He is saying that desire, as an immediate structure of selfhood, cannot finally ground in the self in any way that it hopes. This is what makes the failure of desire developmental rather than merely tragic. Hegel's next move is to show that desire cannot finally be satisfied by things alone. What self-consciousness really seeks is not just the consumption of objects, but confirmation of itself as a self. That's why Hegel says that self-consciousness, quote, attains its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness, end quote. In other words, desire turns out to be social. The self needs recognition. It needs another self-conscious being in whom its own selfhood can be acknowledged and reflected back. This is one of the most important transitions in this chapter because it shows, or in this paper rather, because it shows that desire is more than appetite. It points beyond the object towards a relation between selves. The instability of desire, therefore, does something productive in Hegel. It forces consciousness beyond simple consumption towards a more mediated and social form of self-relation. Even conflict, as in the master-slave dialectic, becomes part of the developmental logic because the self cannot achieve lasting certainty through domination alone. At this point, the Buddhist comparison becomes especially clear. In the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha identifies the key origin of suffering as craving, or tanha, and restless attachment to that, and a restless attachment that reaches outward and leads to renewed dissatisfaction. Craving is not simply wanting pleasant things, it's the deeper movement of attachment that continually seeks satisfaction in what is impermanent, and therefore continually fails to achieve lasting fulfillment. Rupert Gethin emphasizes that craving binds beings to a cycle in which dissatisfaction is reproduced rather than overcome. So the real parallel between Hegel and Buddhism is not that they teach the same doctrine, but that both uncover a self-reproducing structure of dissatisfaction. Desire reaches outward, finds temporary satisfaction, and then returns. But the divergence appears immediately after that shared diagnosis. In Hegel, the failure of desire drives consciousness towards recognition and eventually towards spirit. Whereas in Buddhism, the failure of craving reveals bondage to samsara and points towards the cessation of that craving. That difference sets up the rest of the paper. The next major moment in the paper is Hegel's discussion of the unhappy consciousness. This marks a shift from the earlier account of desire as immediate striving towards objects or recognition. In unhappy consciousness, desire has become inward and reflective. The self is no longer simply trying to overcome something external to it, and instead it experiences itself as divided against itself. Hegel defines the unhappy consciousness as, quote, the consciousness of a self as a divided nature, a doubled and merely contradictory being, end quote. And that definition captures the basic problem. The self is now split internally rather than merely frustrated externally. What produces this split is that consciousness no longer takes its immediate finite existence to be its true essence. It places truth in something beyond itself, in an unchangeable essence that appears eternal, pure, and stable, while the self as it is, actually lived, appears contingent, unstable, and ultimately inadequate. Hegel says that this consciousness contains within itself the duality of self-consciousness and consciousness of an unchangeable essence. So the conflict is no longer simply between self and object, it has become internal to the very structure of selfhood. And that's why the unhappy consciousness is so important for the comparison with Buddhism. Here, desire has become more spiritual and more painful. It is no longer just the appetite that negates objects. It is a reflective form of longing in which the self defines itself through lack, distance, and incompleteness. The self wants union with what it takes to be essential, but that essential reality appears alien and unreachable. In that sense, unhappy consciousness radicalizes the instability already present in desire by making it fully self-aware. At this point in the argument, the Buddhist comparison becomes especially sharp, as Hegel's unhappy consciousness is a form of selfhood that has learned the failure of immediate desire but has not yet found reconciliation. It remains trapped in a relation to an ideal beyond itself, and it continues to experience its own life as marked by lack and insufficiency. And that makes it a useful point of comparison with the Buddhist diagnosis of suffering, because both involve a deep dissatisfaction with ordinary forms of desire and selfhood. But the response in early Buddhism is very different. In the Third Noble Truth, the Buddha defines the cessation of suffering as the fading away and cessation of craving and the giving up and relinquishing of it, finding freedom from it and non-attachment as well. The point here is crucial that Buddhism does not intensify the drama of the divided self, and it does not relocate fulfillment in a transcendent essence that always remains out of reach. Instead, it aims at ending the craving that sustains dissatisfaction in the first place. And this can be easily misunderstood as the doctrine of annihilation, as if liberation meant destroying the self. But the doctrine of anatta or non-self means that we are ordinarily to be that we ordinarily take to be I or mine is already conditioned in an impermanent process. So the issue is not destroying the real self, but losing the clinging that falsely takes impermanent phenomenon to be lasting elements of the self. And that is the decisive contrast. In the unhappy consciousness, the self remains trapped in relation to an ideal beyond and continues to define itself through lack, guilt, and incompleteness. But in early Buddhism, by contrast, the point is loosened and finally to end the clinging that keeps the cycle going. So where Hegel presents a reflective yet unresolved self-division, Buddhism offers a path towards non-attachment and release. In the next movement of the phenomenology, Hegel shows that the instability of desire does not simply disappear after the unhappy consciousness. It reappears in a new and more secular form of the reason chapter, especially in the figure of the law of the heart. Here, consciousness no longer seeks fulfillment in an unchangeable beyond, and instead it tries to find reconciliation in the world by making reality conform to its own inward law. This is why my paper calls it another spiritualized form of desire rather than a genuine escape from desire. Hegel's claim is that this kind of consciousness takes its own inward feeling or conviction to be immediately universal. The individual believes that which is felt in the heart is not merely personal experience, but what ought to govern reality as such. In that sense, desire has changed form. It is no longer simply desire for an object or even longing for transcendence. It is now desire for a world that mirrors my own inner certainty. My perspective appears to me as a universal truth. But Hegel argues that this leads towards what he calls a frenzy of self-conceit. The world resists my inward law, and institutions, other people, and concrete historical realities do not automatically conform to what I feel ought to be true. And as a result, I begin to see the world as corrupt and myself as the bearer of genuine right. And the more that reality resists, the more I intensify my insistence. This is the frenzy, the demand that actuality bend itself to the law I feel within myself. What matters for the larger argument is that desire is still operative here. Even though it has become moralized and universalized, the law of the heart is not an objective universality. It is a failed attempt to make private inwardness into a universal standard. So once again, Hegel reveals a structure in which desire overreaches, fails, and exposes the inadequacy of the standpoint that produces it in the first place. This is where the Buddhist Four Noble Truths become especially important once more. After identifying suffering, its origins in craving, and the cessation of craving, the Buddha teaches the Noble Eightfold Path as the path leading to the cessation of suffering. This path includes right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. This is not simply an inward feeling or a private conviction. It's a disciplined transformation of one's life involving ethical conduct, mental cultivation, and insight. That point sets Buddhism apart very clearly from Hegel's law of the heart. The Buddhist path does not universalize my private standpoint. It does not assume that what I feel inwardly is already the measure of the world, and instead it produces a structured and communal form of training that loosens craving and ignorance. Rupert Ginth describes it as a training in morality, meditation, and wisdom, which means that the path is not a projection of the self outward, but a discipline that works against craving's tendency to reinstall itself. Hegel's trajectory is different. For him, the instability of desire is not resolved by cessation. It is worked through by increasingly mediated forms of relation, recognition, ethical life, and spirit's eventual self-reconciliation. In other words, Hegel does not eliminate desire in the Buddhist sense. He transforms and sublets it into a more complex forms of shared rational and spiritual life. This is why reconciliation is not the same thing as cessation, even if both appear to be responses to dissatisfaction. So by the time we reach this point, the broad comparison hopefully has become quite clear. Both traditions take dissatisfaction seriously, and both see ordinary desire as unstable. But Buddhism offers a path towards relinquishment, while Hegel offers a path of development and transformation. This is the deepest divergence between the two that I highlight in my paper. So, to conclude, the paper argues that three moments in Hegel's phenomenology, the self-consciousness as desire, the unhappy consciousness, and the law of the heart, together trace a coherent arc of unsatisfied wanting. In each case, desire reaches beyond itself in search of certainty or fulfillment, and in each case, it fails in a way that reveals a deeper instability in the ordinary structure of selfhood. Read together, these moments show that dissatisfaction is not incidental in Hegel, it's one of the main engines of consciousness's development. Putting Hegel alongside early Buddhism helps sharpen this insight. The Four Noble Truths offer a clear framework for thinking about suffering, craving, and the cessation of craving, and the path beyond it. When read alongside that framework, Hegel's analysis begins to look like a philosophical account of how desire reproduces dissatisfaction in increasingly complex forms. But the comparison is most useful precisely because it shows the divergence as well as similarity between these two epistemologies. The point is not that Hegel arrives at Buddhist liberation, but that Buddhist thought makes visible what is distinctive in Hegel's own solution. The final contrast, then, is straightforward but important. For early Buddhism, the instability of desire points towards the need to end craving and loosen attachment to the self. For Hegel, the same instability pushes consciousness towards reconciliation, where desire is not simply removed, but transformed through recognition, ethical institution, and shared spiritual life. So the question that remains at the end of this is whether Hegel truly resolves desire or whether he ultimately preserves it in a more mediated form. That question matters because it shows why this comparison is philosophically interesting. It's not just about finding similarities between two traditions, it's about asking what dissatisfaction means, what kind of self it presupposes, and whether the deepest human problem is solved by relinquishing desire or by educating it into a higher form. That'll just about do it for me. So I thank you all for your time and your attention. I welcome any questions, comments, or concerns. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. Have a great one.